Hello again, Shakespeare students. Welcome back. Your dreams were your ticket out. I bet that Lynn's the only person who gets that reference, perhaps. Um, Anyways, John Travolta's first role, I believe. So we'll continue with our discussion questions here. Um, Question number 2. In the play's first act, we see King Lear present a consciously staged scene to compel his daughters to express their love for him. Notice how this scene is framed. When Cordelia disobediently refuses to participate, what is her explanation? How do you see Lear's demands and Cordelia's response? I believe I touched on this issue briefly in the brief video that I made last week, but basically the way this starts, this has a similar uh, feel to it to the comedies. You typically have a father and a daughter figure, as we've said previously, the senex iratus, the angry old man, who is unwilling to recognize that he needs to cede his place as the most important man in his daughter's life. And so daddy's little girl becomes a young woman, and the young woman becomes someone who is eventually going to be less and less under the influence and in the sphere of her father, and eventually she will find, perhaps, for the context of these plays anyways, another man, a husband who will take the father's place. And so we see that very, very pointedly, and I'll read the lines. I believe I read exactly the same lines, but they can be a good starting point for us when he asks Cordelia to praise him after both Goneril and Regan have done so. And Cordelia says, basically nothing, and Lear responds negatively. He's angry about this. And she says, unhappy that I am, I cannot heave my heart into my mouth. I love your majesty according to my bond, no more nor less. Okay, bond is an interesting term here. Bond is typically can be a word expressing an emotive connection, a familial bond, but it also has a kind of a legalistic connection to it. When you talk about a bond is a contractual obligation. That's kind of curious because what we're talking about in this whole scene is also vaguely, it's familial, but it's also contractual. And all of these weddings, the wedding, the two dukes, the Duke of Albany and the Duke of Cornwall, who already represent pieces of Great Britain, right? We've said that previously also, that Albany is traditionally associated with Scotland, Cornwall with Wales, and Cordelia would presumably get the richest third. It's kind of a curious way that he frames it, but that you will, going to divide it up into thirds, and Cordelia is going to get the best of the equal three parts, and accept that she doesn't play by the rules that Lear is expecting her to play by, and so very quickly she ends up with nothing. As she says, nothing is what she's going to say in order to outdo her sisters. And the lines that I focused on last time, good my lord, you have begot me, bred me, loved me. I return those duties back as are right fit. Obey you, love you, and most honor you. Why have my sisters husbands if they say they love you all? Happily when I shall wed, that lord whose hand must take my plight shall carry half of my love with him, half of my care and duty. Sure I shall never marry like my sisters, to love my father all. Once again, you have in a very concise form the crux of the problem, that Cordelia is saying that she's a young woman. She's actually has two suitors, France and Burgundy, basically waiting to make their propositions to her. And she's saying that, I love you as a daughter is supposed to love a father, and she's not going to gush on the way her two sisters have previously. Also, I mean, one of the key things is that the two sisters are very clearly false in their pronouncements, and Cordelia, by equaling them or outdoing them, is also kind of going down to their level. They demean her words, even though they might be real. And so entering into that is kind of a delicate issue for her. But you notice that the phrasing has to do with the phrasing of the marriage vows, to love, honor, and obey. Obey you, love you, and most honor you. And she's, of course, talking about her sisters and their husbands. And Ursula is complaining in the other room. I apologize if she's disrupting for you. And so she, makes note of that in fact she cannot be only dedicated to her father. And so she feels bad, but she will not play the game. And of course, Lear's response, we've said this before. I mean, Lear is being pretty petulant and petty, I think, to say that he's quite aware that Cordelia is the one who really loves him, and that's what hurts him the most, right? The ones who love you the most can also hurt you the most, and so her refusal to play his game is painful to him, but it's also kind of a recognition that he's making, the demands that he's making might not be necessarily reasonable for him to make, and of course here we see his irrationality right at the beginning of the play. This is the first example of Lear being irrational. And of course, very quickly, Kent comes to Cordelia's defense. And we early on we see that actually Cordelia and Kent are the two people who really care about Lear. The other people around are vaguely, certainly the two other sisters are quite opportunistic, and you could argue that there's lots of other people who are there, that they don't have Lear's best interests at heart necessarily. So that's a pretty important scene, and it really lays out a lot of the terms of the problem. As I said, looking at the comic resolution of these types of plays, where the father figure, the senex iratus, stands in the way of the young woman receiving her independence and her happiness. Typically, the resolution of those plays is that something causes the father to rethink what he's done and what he's proposed and to reconsider. The tragic versions, unfortunately, don't typically have that, right? And so the father doesn't get the opportunity to rethink. And obviously, by the time Cordelia comes back towards the end of the play, the die is cast, as they say, and it's already it's the end game, basically. So there's not going to be a happy ending to this play by then. We know that. Let's look at the next question. Let me see where I am with time. So what is it that initially causes both Goneril and Regan to lose patience with their father? Are we led to feel any sympathy for their positions? I'd be curious to hear what you all have to say about this question. Are we led to feel any sympathy for their positions? Now, Goneril and Regan are not hugely sympathetic figures. We don't have a whole lot of positive feelings for them. However, what they react to in Lear's behavior it's reasonable the way they react, and depending on how you see it staged, I believe I watched last week. I watched the Ian McKellen Royal Shakespeare Company version of this play, which I believe was directed by Trevor Nunn, 2007, 2008, somewhere in there. And in that scene, in that particular version of the play, in that scene where Lear is coming with his 100 men to the castles, and basically what he's decided is he's going to, now that he's abdicated his throne, he's going to rotate and be a guest at the houses of his beloved daughters, the daughters who love him so much. Will certainly tolerate and put up with him and his retinue. And his retinue is 100 men, and they're basically drunken brawlers, and they're, grabbing the women who are waiting on them and making noise and drinking and getting in fights. And so there's a kind of this uproarious reality in the castle brought by them. And both Goneril first and then Regan afterwards react to that in a very negative way. And of course, they are who they are. We see their true colors soon enough. It doesn't take long for those to show. But that said, Lear is making, what we could call unreasonable demands on them. Imagine your guest shows up with 100 stragglers, hangers-on, and expects you to feed them and house them and take care of them. That might grow old very, very quickly. And so the two daughters lose patience with Lear quite rapidly, but there might be an element, that might be the one moment in the play where we could conceivably sympathize with them. And again, that depends how it's played, because usually these two are, unalloyed evil, the two of them, and so there's nothing very positive at all about them. Okay, let's see, we should stop here. I won't be able to embark on the next question. We'll come back in a moment. Bye.